Among the many figures associated with the Chernobyl disaster, few have become as controversial, misunderstood, or demonized as Anatoly Dyatlov. To millions around the world, particularly after documentaries, books, and television dramatizations, Dyatlov became the embodiment of Soviet arrogance and recklessness, a cold and authoritarian engineer who bullied exhausted operators into conducting a dangerous experiment that destroyed Reactor No. 4 at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant during the early hours of 26 April 1986. There is substantial evidence supporting this image. Witnesses describe Dyatlov as harsh, impatient, intimidating, and contemptuous of hesitation. During the fatal safety test, he reportedly dismissed concerns from operators and continued pushing the experiment forward, even as the reactor entered increasingly unstable conditions. After the explosion itself, he refused for crucial minutes, and perhaps longer, to believe that the reactor core had actually exploded, despite overwhelming evidence that catastrophic destruction had occurred. Some of the men under his authority were exposed to lethal radiation because of this refusal to accept reality. Yet reducing the disaster to the personality of one man obscures the deeper truth about both Dyatlov and the Soviet Union itself. Dyatlov was not simply a uniquely evil or irrational individual. He was the product of a political and institutional culture that rewarded emotional hardness, punished uncertainty, concealed technical flaws, glorified obedience, and taught generations of Soviet engineers that failure was unacceptable. His personality had also been profoundly shaped by personal tragedy, particularly the death of his son from leukemia after years of Dyatlov's work in the nuclear industry. This loss appears to have intensified an already rigid personality, hardening him psychologically and reinforcing his belief that discipline, authority, and technical control were the only protections against chaos. The story of Dyatlov is therefore inseparable from the story of the late Soviet Union itself. The explosion at Chernobyl was not merely a technological accident caused by operator mistakes. It was the culmination of decades of systemic dysfunction, ideological arrogance, institutional secrecy, and psychological conditioning. Dyatlov stood at the center of these forces. He was simultaneously an individual decision-maker and a representative product of the world that created him. To understand why the disaster unfolded as it did, it is necessary to understand not only what Dyatlov did during those catastrophic hours in April 1986, but also how his personality, his trauma, his professional culture, and the immense pressures of the Soviet nuclear system shaped his actions. Anatoly Dyatlov was born in 1931 during one of the harshest and most brutal periods in Soviet history. The Soviet Union of his childhood was dominated by the rule of Joseph Stalin, whose regime transformed the country through industrialization, collectivization, political terror, and relentless ideological control. Soviet citizens of Dyatlov's generation grew up in a society where fear and authority were woven into daily life. The culture of Stalinist Russia profoundly influenced the psychology of those who matured within it. Children were taught to admire discipline, sacrifice, endurance, and obedience to the state above all else. Emotional vulnerability was often interpreted as weakness. Questioning authority could carry severe consequences. Ambitious young men entering technical professions learned early that advancement depended not merely on competence, but on conformity and loyalty. Dyatlov's formative years also coincided with the immense trauma of World War II, known in the Soviet Union as the Great Patriotic War. The German invasion brought devastation on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire cities were destroyed, millions died, and survival required extraordinary endurance. Soviet society emerged from the war deeply militarized psychologically. Hardness became a virtue. Stoicism became essential. For many Soviet citizens who came of age during these years, authority and survival became closely linked concepts. Order meant safety. Discipline meant survival. Hesitation could be fatal. These assumptions would profoundly shape Dyatlov's worldview decades later inside the control room at Chernobyl. The Soviet Union also increasingly glorified science and engineering after the war. Nuclear technology, in particular, became associated with national prestige and strategic survival. Following the American use of atomic bombs against Japan and the onset of the Cold War, Soviet leaders viewed nuclear development as essential to preserving the state itself. Engineers working in the nuclear field were therefore not merely technicians. They were participants in what the Soviet regime regarded as a historic struggle for national survival and ideological superiority. Young engineers like Dyatlov entered adulthood believing that technical achievement was a patriotic duty. Nuclear science carried an aura of immense prestige, secrecy, and strategic importance. It also existed within a political culture that tolerated little dissent and demanded absolute confidence in Soviet systems. Dyatlov eventually studied at the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute, one of the Soviet Union's most important centers for nuclear education and technical training. Admission to such an institution required considerable intellectual ability, and by all accounts, Dyatlov was an intelligent and highly capable engineer. The Soviet nuclear establishment of the 1950s existed within a unique atmosphere of secrecy, ambition, and ideological intensity. Soviet leaders regarded nuclear development as one of the primary arenas of competition with the United States. Engineers working in this field operated under immense pressure, but also enjoyed elite status within Soviet society. The culture of Soviet technical education emphasized precision, discipline, and hierarchy, and students were trained to think systematically and decisively. There was little emphasis on emotional intelligence, collaborative leadership, or open debate. Soviet engineering culture valued certainty and control above all else. Dyatlov thrived in this environment. He developed a reputation as technically competent, meticulous, and demanding. However, even early in his career, there were indications that he possessed a harsh and abrasive personality. Colleagues often described him as impatient with mistakes and intolerant of what he considered incompetence. Such traits were not unusual in Soviet technical institutions. Engineers and managers who displayed absolute confidence and strict discipline were often rewarded. Those who hesitated or questioned procedures too openly could find themselves marginalized. The Soviet bureaucracy valued results and obedience far more than empathy or interpersonal sensitivity. This institutional culture would become deeply important later at Chernobyl, where operators often feared contradicting senior personnel even when serious safety concerns arose. After completing his education, Dyatlov worked in the Soviet nuclear navy, participating in the operation and development of reactors aboard nuclear submarines. This period further intensified many of the psychological traits that later defined him. Nuclear submarines represented one of the most dangerous and tightly controlled environments in the Soviet military system. Mistakes could kill entire crews within minutes. Radiation leaks, reactor failures, and mechanical breakdowns posed constant risks. Officers were expected to maintain strict authority at all times. Within such an environment, hesitation was often viewed as dangerous. Chain of command discipline became sacred. Officers learned to suppress emotion, project certainty, and enforce obedience relentlessly. Soviet naval culture, particularly within the nuclear fleet, emphasized control under pressure above all else. Dyatlov appears to have internalized these values deeply. He became known as a highly demanding supervisor who expected immediate compliance with instructions. Subordinates who hesitated or questioned decisions often faced anger or humiliation. Importantly, many colleagues also considered him exceptionally knowledgeable. Even individuals who disliked him frequently admitted that he understood reactor systems extremely well. This combination of intelligence and authoritarianism made him a formidable figure within Soviet nuclear institutions. The nuclear navy also exposed him continuously to the possibility of catastrophe. Unlike civilians, naval nuclear personnel operated in environments where accidents could instantly become fatal. This constant awareness of danger may paradoxically have strengthened Dyatlov's belief that strict discipline was the only effective protection against disaster. The result was a man who increasingly equated authority with safety and viewed challenges to authority as threats to operational control itself. One of the most important but least publicly understood aspects of Dyatlov's life was the death of his son from leukemia. Although details remain debated, many accounts suggest the illness may have been linked to radiation exposure associated with Dyatlov's earlier work in the nuclear industry. Whether or not this connection can ever be medically proven with certainty, the emotional impact on Dyatlov appears to have been devastating. The Soviet Union provided little cultural space for emotional processing or psychological healing. Particularly among men in military and technical professions, grief was expected to remain private and controlled. Vulnerability was often considered shameful. Rather than softening Dyatlov, the loss appears to have hardened him further. Colleagues later described him as emotionally distant, severe, and intensely work-focused. It is possible that he coped with grief by retreating further into technical rationality and professional discipline. This psychological transformation is critical to understanding his later behavior at Chernobyl. Trauma can produce very different responses in different individuals. In Dyatlov's case, personal suffering seems to have reinforced his need for control and certainty. Admitting vulnerability may have become psychologically intolerable. There is also an important irony here. Despite losing a child potentially connected to radiation exposure, Dyatlov did not become anti-nuclear or fearful of reactor technology. Instead, he appears to have concluded that the true danger came not from the technology itself, but from human weakness, disorder, or incompetence. This mindset likely intensified his contempt for hesitation and emotional expression among subordinates. To Dyatlov, fear may have represented loss of control, and loss of control represented catastrophe. By the time he arrived at Chernobyl, he had become a man psychologically conditioned by decades of Soviet authoritarian culture, military nuclear discipline, and unresolved personal grief. The Soviet Union of the 1970s and early 1980s was entering a period often described as the era of stagnation. Under leaders such as Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet economy slowed dramatically. Bureaucratic inefficiency spread throughout the system. Yet despite mounting economic problems, Soviet propaganda continued portraying the USSR as a technologically superior superpower. Nuclear energy became central to these ambitions. Massive reactors were constructed across the Soviet Union to meet growing energy demands and demonstrate scientific progress. Among the most important of these facilities was the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. The plant stood near the purpose-built city of Pripyat, a modern Soviet showcase community populated largely by engineers, technicians, and their families. To Soviet authorities, Chernobyl symbolized the future, technologically advanced, orderly, and rational. Yet beneath this image lay serious systemic problems. The RBMK reactor design used at Chernobyl possessed dangerous flaws, including a dangerous positive void coefficient that could cause rapid power surges under certain conditions. Some experts within the Soviet nuclear establishment were aware of these dangers, but information about them was often poorly communicated or hidden altogether. The Soviet bureaucracy also created powerful incentives to prioritize production over safety. Managers feared delays, failed targets, and criticism from higher authorities. Reporting problems could damage careers. Admitting weaknesses in Soviet technology carried ideological implications, since official doctrine insisted that socialist industry was superior to capitalist systems. This culture of secrecy and institutional denial was critically important. Many reactor operators genuinely believed catastrophic explosions were impossible in RBMK reactors because the Soviet system had effectively taught them this. Dyatlov himself appears to have shared this belief completely. At Chernobyl, Dyatlov served as deputy chief engineer, a powerful and influential position within the plant hierarchy. He quickly gained a reputation as one of the most feared managers at the station. Workers described him as aggressive, demanding, and often verbally abusive. Operators who made mistakes could expect harsh criticism. Some employees reportedly dreaded working under him. However, this reputation must again be understood within Soviet institutional culture. Dyatlov was not considered abnormal by the standards of many Soviet industrial managers. In fact, his style was often associated with professionalism and seriousness. The Soviet workplace frequently rewarded authoritarian supervisors because they appeared decisive and efficient. Leaders who maintained strict discipline were often promoted. Subordinates learned to avoid contradicting superiors openly. This culture had dangerous implications inside a nuclear power plant, where safety depended partly upon the willingness of operators to voice concerns and challenge questionable decisions. At Chernobyl, however, hierarchy often overrode caution. Dyatlov also worked within a system facing increasing political and economic pressure. Reactor downtime disrupted energy production targets. Delays created administrative complications. Successful completion of technical procedures mattered not merely operationally, but bureaucratically. By April 1986, all of these institutional pressures converged around the planned turbine rundown test on Reactor No. 4. The safety test scheduled for Reactor No. 4 was intended to determine whether residual turbine momentum could temporarily power emergency cooling systems during a loss of electricity. The concept itself was not irrational, and similar tests had been attempted previously. However, the circumstances surrounding the April 1986 test became increasingly dangerous as the evening progressed. Originally, the reactor was supposed to reduce power gradually earlier in the day. However, electricity demand from the Kiev region delayed the shutdown process for many hours. As a result, the test was postponed until the night shift, a less experienced crew. This delay already placed operators under significant stress. The test needed to be completed. Bureaucratic expectations remained in place. Reactor conditions became increasingly unstable. At one point, power levels dropped catastrophically low due to operator error. Rather than shutting the reactor down entirely, operators attempted to raise power again by withdrawing control rods far beyond safe operational limits. This decision proved critical. The RBMK reactor design became extremely unstable at low power levels, particularly when too many control rods were removed. Yet many operators did not fully understand the severity of this danger because the Soviet system had inadequately communicated reactor vulnerabilities. During these tense hours, Dyatlov reportedly pressured operators to continue. Witnesses later described him as impatient and dismissive of concerns. Some operators were reportedly reluctant to challenge him directly because of his intimidating personality and senior authority. The atmosphere inside the control room reflected broader Soviet institutional culture. Obedience mattered. Completing assigned tasks mattered. Openly confronting superiors carried risks. Dyatlov's behavior that night reflected decades of psychological conditioning. To him, abandoning the test likely appeared unacceptable. Delays represented failure. Hesitation represented weakness. Authority had to be maintained. As reactor conditions deteriorated, his insistence on continuing became increasingly catastrophic. At approximately 1:23 a.m., operators pressed the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button. What followed was catastrophic. Because of fatal design flaws within the RBMK reactor, the insertion of the control rods initially increased reactivity instead of reducing it. A massive power surge occurred almost instantly. Fuel channels ruptured, steam explosions tore apart the reactor core. The reactor building exploded violently. The Chernobyl disaster had begun. One of the most psychologically revealing aspects of Dyatlov's behavior occurred immediately afterward. Despite overwhelming destruction, he reportedly refused to believe the reactor core had exploded. This refusal is often portrayed simply as arrogance or stupidity, but it reflected something deeper and more systemic. The idea that an RBMK reactor could explode contradicted everything Soviet operators had been taught. Soviet nuclear doctrine effectively insisted such a catastrophe was impossible. Accepting that the reactor had exploded would have required accepting that the Soviet system itself had fundamentally failed. Dyatlov therefore interpreted events through the framework available to him. He assumed hydrogen explosions or pipe ruptures had occurred, not total reactor destruction. This denial had terrible consequences. Workers were ordered to continue pumping water into what was no longer an intact reactor. Firefighters and plant personnel entered areas saturated with lethal radiation. Many received fatal doses. Some witnesses later described Dyatlov as still attempting to maintain authority and operational control even as reality collapsed around him. This behavior reflected both his personality and his training. Soviet authority structures conditioned leaders never to admit panic or uncertainty openly. Yet at Chernobyl, this rigidity became fatal. The disaster escalated not only because the reactor exploded, but because the people in charge psychologically could not immediately comprehend what had happened. In the aftermath of the disaster, Soviet authorities faced an immense political crisis. The explosion exposed profound weaknesses within the Soviet system at a time when Mikhail Gorbachev was attempting to reform the USSR through policies of glasnost and perestroika. Initially, Soviet authorities attempted to minimize and conceal the scale of the disaster. Evacuation of Pripyat was delayed. Information was tightly controlled. International acknowledgement occurred only after radiation alarms were triggered in Scandinavia. The Soviet leadership soon needed individuals to blame. Dyatlov and several other plant officials became central targets of the state investigation. They were accused of violating safety procedures and recklessly conducting the test. There was truth in these accusations. The operators, including Dyatlov, had indeed violated important regulations. However, the Soviet government initially minimized the role of reactor design flaws and systemic institutional problems. This allowed the state to preserve the broader legitimacy of Soviet nuclear technology while blaming individuals lower in the hierarchy. Dyatlov himself fiercely rejected aspects of the official narrative. In later writings and interviews, he argued that operators had never been adequately informed about critical RBMK reactor dangers. Subsequent investigations partially supported this claim. Over time, it became increasingly clear that the disaster resulted from both operator mistakes and serious design defects, hidden or minimized by the Soviet nuclear establishment. Nevertheless, Dyatlov remained one of the principal public faces of the catastrophe. Dyatlov was convicted and sentenced to prison for gross violations of safety procedures. The trial reflected the contradictions of the late Soviet system. On one hand, authorities acknowledged failures within the plant. On the other, they continued shielding deeper structural problems from full public scrutiny. By this point, Dyatlov himself had suffered serious radiation exposure during the disaster. His health deteriorated significantly. After his release due to illness, he spent much of his remaining life defending his actions and criticizing the Soviet nuclear establishment. He wrote memoirs arguing that operators had been placed in impossible conditions by flawed reactor design and inadequate information. His writings reveal a deeply complicated personality. He remained defensive and often unwilling to fully accept personal responsibility. Yet he also displayed genuine technical understanding and bitter awareness of how Soviet secrecy had contributed to catastrophe. Dyatlov died in 1995 from illnesses associated with radiation exposure. Modern historical analysis increasingly views Anatoly Dyatlov not simply as an individual villain, but as a representative product of Soviet institutional culture. His authoritarianism reflected the Soviet emphasis on hierarchy and discipline. His emotional hardness reflected both personal trauma and broader cultural expectations. His refusal to acknowledge reactor destruction reflected years of ideological conditioning about Soviet technological superiority. The Soviet system rewarded individuals who projected certainty and punished those who openly expressed doubt. Engineers learned that confidence was politically valuable even when uncertainty existed technically. This created a profoundly dangerous environment inside high-risk industries like nuclear power. At Chernobyl, technical flaws combined with institutional secrecy, bureaucratic pressure, and psychological rigidity. Dyatlov embodied all of these forces simultaneously. He was both responsible for the disaster and shaped by the system that produced it. Anatoly Dyatlov remains one of the most tragic and controversial figures of the late Soviet era. He was intelligent, technically skilled, disciplined, and psychologically hardened by decades of institutional pressure and personal suffering. Yet these same qualities became catastrophic liabilities on the night of 26 April 1986. His insistence on control, his hostility toward hesitation, and his inability to emotionally process uncertainty contributed directly to one of the worst technological disasters in human history. At the same time, his behavior cannot be separated from the Soviet system that shaped him, a system built upon secrecy, authoritarianism, ideological certainty, and fear of failure. The Chernobyl disaster was therefore not merely the story of an explosion inside a nuclear reactor. It was the story of a political and psychological culture collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Dyatlov became the human face of that collapse because he embodied so many of the system's defining characteristics. He believed absolutely in discipline, authority, and Soviet technological power. When reality contradicted those beliefs in the most horrifying way imaginable, he struggled to comprehend what was happening even as the reactor burned around him. In the end, Chernobyl revealed not only the flaws of a reactor design, but the flaws of an entire civilization built upon suppression of doubt and fear of truth. Anatoly Dyatlov stood at the center of that revelation, not as a monster separated from his society, but as one of its most complete creations. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.